As countries teeter on the brink of bankruptcy, citizens are driven to desperate measures.
तो सातवीं रात यानी हमारी शुरू हो गई समंदर के दरमियान, साथ ही हमारा शिप जो है ना उलट गया। जिस साइड से नजर जाती थी पानी में लाशें लाशें, कोई हाल नहीं था, छोटे छोटे बच्चों की लाशें।
A debt crisis is spreading.
The IMF is seeing 70 countries as potentially the next Sri Lankas out there, and we really have to act and act urgently.
And climate change is making the debt problem even worse.
Pakistan is forgetting that there is no free money available. You cannot borrow more. You don't have the appetite to borrow more.
当下的全球的债务已经到了100年来最高的这样的程度。美国呢再次突破所谓美债的上限，不少发展中国家的债务呢也进入到一个崩溃的边缘。中国的地方债呢也非常的严重，全球将会爆发一场超过2008年，甚至像1930年代那样的大萧条式的经济危机的爆发。
June 14, 2023. A trawler packed with illegal migrants capsizes off the coast of southern Greece. At least 350 Pakistanis are on board. Some 4,300 kilometers away, the news sends shockwaves to Kalaki, a village in Gujarat, central Punjab. At least 3 men on board the boat are from this village. One of them has miraculously survived. 27-year-old Usman Sadiq was a police constable when he decided to embark on that treacherous voyage. The country's inflation rate had climbed to 38%, the highest reading since records began in 1957. Financially strapped and dreaming of a better future, Usman left Pakistan in May 2023.
सर मोटिवेशन आपको पता है कि जिस तरह के हालात हैं हमारे पाकिस्तान के, महंगाई बहुत ज़्यादा है। हालांकि मैं जॉब करता हूँ, तो सिर्फ यही सोचा था कि जाऊँगा अपने माँ बाप की यानी ख्वाहिशात को पूरा करूँगा, अपने बीवी बच्चों को पूरा करूँगा ख्वाहिशात को, और अपने बच्चों को अच्छे स्कूल में यानी पढ़ाऊँगा। तो 3 मई की उसने टिकटें वगैरह करवाई। उधर से हम मिस्र की फ़्लाइट के लिए रवाना हो गए। उधर से फिर तकरीबन 2 या 4 घंटे का स्टे उन्होंने किया, तो उधर से हमें लीबिया ले गए बाई एयर।
Once in Libya, around 700 illegal migrants, the majority of them Pakistanis, were stuffed onto a dilapidated boat, and their perilous journey began towards Greece.
तो 7वीं रात यानी हमारी शुरू हो गई समंदर के दरमियान। तो साथ ही 1 या 2 मिनट नहीं गुजरे, यानी हम अपनी जगह पर जिधर बैठे हुए थे ना, उठ के उस जगह पे हम सिर्फ खड़े होने का यानी हमें टाइम मिला। साथ ही हमारा शिप जो है ना उलट गया। सारे के सारे हम पानी में नीचे आ गए, शिप हमारे ऊपर आ गए, नीचे गोते खाने लग गए। क्योंकि हम भी तकरीबन 4-5 घंटे उधर ही सर्वाइव करते रहे पानी में। मुझे तो एक छोटी सी फट्टी मिल गई थी जिसका थोड़ा मैंने सहारा ले लिया, या फोम के थोड़े 2-3 मैंने जूते पकड़ लिए थे, तो उनकी वजह से जब मैं थक जाता था तैर तैर के, उनके सहारे की वजह से मैं थोड़ा अपने आप को यानी सुकून में ले लेता था। भाई अपनी पुरानी याद आ गई है कि हम भी इस तरह शिप में बैठ के गए, तो साथ वाले दोस्त जब मरे हैं तो बड़ा बुरा टाइम था हमारे पे। जिस साइड से नज़र जाती थी पानी में लाशें लाशें, कोई हाल नहीं था, छोटे छोटे बच्चों की लाशें। सुबह जिस टाइम फजर का टाइम हुआ ना, फजर का टाइम, उस टाइम वो हमारे करीब आया, वो जो नेवी का शिप था, उनको उन्होंने रिसीव करके हमें बड़े शिप में डाला।
Usman eventually returned to Pakistan with the aid of the UN's International Organization for Migration. His friends who accompanied him on the voyage remain missing. In fiscal year 2023, nearly 8% of Pakistanis of Usman's age have not been able to find employment, according to IMF projections. More than 800,000 Pakistanis have left the country in search of better economic prospects abroad. Leaving Pakistan for better opportunities is the new reality for many in the country. A dire downturn caused by decades of mismanagement and political instability has drained dollar reserves, spurred runaway inflation, and caused widespread factory closures. On the brink of default, Pakistan approached the IMF to intervene. After months of negotiations, Islamabad was bailed out with a $3 billion standby arrangement in June 2023.
IMF is the emergency ward of the world. And we've gone to it 24 times in 75 years. In fact, we've never been out of the emergency ward. The problem is that we celebrate going to the IMF. No, nobody needs to celebrate going to the IMF. It will not fix you. So their conditions are always very simple. Raise taxes, cut the fiscal deficit, let the exchange rate go, and at the same time, do a little bit of price adjustments. But those conditions are not going to make us grow. Even the IMF keeps saying in every report that we need structural reforms. Nobody talks about what those structural reforms are. But the key thing is that our industry must be competitive and all our industry must export.
The economic crisis is directly linked to the country's trade gap. In fiscal year 2022, Pakistan's trade deficit reached a daunting $48.35 billion, forcing the outgoing government of Shahbaz Sharif to place a ban on non-essential imports. The move was aimed to stop the outflow of dollars in a country critically low on foreign exchange reserves that were meant to repay foreign debt.
The biggest elephant in the room is the debt stress. Pakistan is spending more than 50% of our budget on debt servicing. After we pay our markups and some principal, as a matter of fact, our tax collection is zeroed out. The rest of the running of the state is all on the borrowed money. There's an economy which is largely dependent on imports. And that's where we end up going back to IMF again and again and again.
The price is being paid by sectors that have consistently brought precious foreign exchange into the country. Pakistan's textile industry contributes approximately 61% to the total output. In Asia, Pakistan is the 8th largest exporter of textile products. Faisalabad is one of the major textile cities of Pakistan, housing the country's largest textile companies. It provides employment for about 40% of the country's total industrial workforce. But Faisalabad's textile exports have been dented due to the government's import ban of raw cotton to control the flight of dollars out of Pakistan. The government followed that up by raising electricity tariffs, a key precondition for the IMF deal to go through, and as a means of raising tax revenues to bridge Pakistan's fiscal deficit. Wahid Halik Rami is the chairman of the Council of Loom Owners Association of Pakistan, who oversees 90% of Pakistan's weaving industry.
खुसूसन हमारी एनर्जी प्राइसेस जो हैं ये बहुत एक मेजर पोर्शन होता है हमारी कॉस्ट ऑफ प्रोडक्शन का ऑब्वियसली तो इसके ऊपर बहुत ज़्यादा बढ़ गया बिजली की कीमतें जो हैं लेकिन बिजली का जो कहते हैं कि जिन है ना इसने हमारे इंडस्ट्री को निगल लिया है और हमारे जो ये इंडस्ट्रियल एरियाज़ हैं इस वक्त ये मैं समझता हूँ कि ये इंडस्ट्री का, ये मशीनरी का कब्रिस्तान बने हुए हैं। आप भी आपने विजिट किया है, आपने हर दूसरी फैक्ट्री के ऊपर ताले लगे हुए देखे हैं।
Almost a third of all power looms and associated factories have shut as a result, leading to widespread unemployment. The textile sector has lost almost 700,000 jobs in 2023 alone.
और जो भी फैक्ट्रीज चलती हैं वो अपनी 60% कैपेसिटी पे चल रही है, 35-40% कैपेसिटी पे वो काम नहीं कर रहे क्योंकि बिजली की कीमतें इतनी ज़्यादा हैं। इसकी वजह से अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट है। हमारे वर्कर्स जो हैं इनका कोई हाल कोई नहीं है। इनको ज़ाहिर है जब ये जितना काम करेंगे उतने इनको पैसे मिलने हैं। तो फैक्ट्रीज 2-2 दिन हफ्ते के अंदर जो है वो बंद होती हैं, वो नागा करती हैं, और अगर एक 24 घंटे में भी वो 16 घंटे चलती हैं। तो ये एक बड़ा इस वक्त डार्क पीरियड के अंदर चल रहे हैं। तो इसी ने हमारी जो कॉस्ट ऑफ प्रोडक्शन ने हमारी एक्सपोर्ट को भी बड़ा हार्ट किया है।
Textile exports have declined by 14%, or $2.2 billion in the first 10 months of fiscal year 2022-2023. It is not just driven by rising costs of production, but also by Pakistan's debt problem. A shortage of dollars in Pakistan to pay back its debt had skyrocketed the exchange rate to a historical high of more than 300 Pakistani rupees to $1. Pakistan's economy suffered another blow in 2022 when floods submerged a third of the country. The floods washed away $40 billion worth of infrastructure. August 2022. Pakistan is inundated with its worst floods in living memory, with 1/3 of the country underwater. The Pakistani army is called in to undertake relief operations in low-lying areas in Sindh, the worst affected province of the country. More than 12.5 million people are rendered homeless. In the village of Qasim Shuragut, farmers continue to struggle from the after effects of last year's floods. 30-year-old farmer Mohammed Ors, his wife Saima and their 2 children had their entire home submerged in the waters last year.
जब सैलाब का पानी आया उस टाइम ये अचानक पानी आ गया था, बंद टूटा था दरिया का। तो ऐसी हालत हुई कि हमारे बच्चे चीखे कर रहे थे, सामान लेने में मुश्किलात हो रही थी, बहुत ऐसी बुरी हालत थी कि हम बता भी नहीं सकते। ऐसा हाल हो रहा था कि मुश्किल से अपने बच्चों को थोड़ा सा सामान को निकाल के यहाँ पे पहुँचे हैं।
Ors and his family are among a population of 500,000 still living in camps like these across the country. Many like him have been unable to rebuild their homes. Ors practiced subsistence agriculture to feed his family, but with no land left to till, he has lost his primary means to survive.
अभी जो पानी खड़ा हो गया है बिल्कुल ख़राब हो गया है। आप खुद देख रहे हो, बिल्कुल काला पीला हो गया है। इससे बहुत सी बीमारियां जन्म लेंगी। इसमें से अभी भी मलेरिया, गैस्ट्रो, ये तो वैसे चीज़ें चल रही है जो ये हालात और बदतर होंगे आगे चल के। यूँ कि ये पानी जैसे जैसे खड़ा होगा ना, जैसे जैसे दिन गुजरते जाएंगे उतना ये पानी ख़राब होता जाएगा। इसमें बदबू आ जाएगी, मच्छर पे मच्छर होंगे। उसके अलावा यहाँ पे और भी बहुत सी वो बीमारियाँ और भी पैदा होंगी।
Pakistan saw a 4-fold increase in the reported number of malaria cases after the floods, landing the government with a hefty health bill on top of billions desperately needed to rebuild infrastructure and restore farmlands. Pakistan did receive $10 billion in funding pledges, but much of that was offered in the form of loans. Swarmed in debt, Pakistan was unable to build a strong case for climate justice to receive grants instead.
Pakistan is an example of the injustices faced by a country that is on the front lines of both the debt and the climate crises. I think we were all horrified at the extent of the devastation and the destruction created by the flooding last year, which itself was created by the climate emergency, which Pakistan has had probably the least responsibility for because it accounts for less than 1% of global carbon emissions. And what should have happened last year at the point at which these floods happened is that Pakistan should have gone through a process for some level of debt restructuring and debt cancellation. But instead, what happened is the IMF decided, as it normally does, is to lend it more money. And by lending it more money, the loan also came with strings attached around austerity measures. And so what's happened is that Pakistan is now more indebted than it was last year.
Pakistan is the 5th most vulnerable country to climate change, according to the Global Climate Risk Index. The lives of 250 million Pakistanis have been directly impacted by global warming. But the country's insurmountable external debts make it almost impossible for the government to fight such existential threats.
Pakistan is forgetting that there is no free money available. Now, you cannot borrow more. You don't have the appetite to borrow more.
Activists in Pakistan are demanding that the world's richest countries take responsibility for their past and present carbon emissions. Thus far, pledges for aid are not keeping pace with the ravages from climate change.
Here we have a problem of not just national but international climate governance and denialism about its actual ferocity and scale of what climate change can do to the human race, to populations in particularly vulnerable countries and situations. The carbon-intensive lifestyles of the West that have come into all our countries have to be rethought. We would need $101 billion to make that transition from dirty coal, from dirty energy, to clean energy.
As Pakistan grapples with its debt, the role of China has also come under intense debate. Islamabad now owes nearly 1/3 of its overwhelming external debt to Beijing. China has helped by rolling over a previous $2.4 billion loan in 2023 for the next 2 years to save Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves. There's also been a renewed push to reinvigorate the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, which is a multi-billion-dollar Belt and Road program that drastically slowed down due to COVID-19. But there are some who question if Pakistan should take on more costly infrastructure projects. As debates continue, China and Pakistan inked a $10 billion deal to rebuild the 12,000-kilometer-long Karachi-Peshawar ML1 railway track. Initially constructed by the British Raj, Pakistan Railways has to make routine repairs to keep trains running on the dilapidated track. It's a government entity neck-deep in default. The Pakistan government routinely pumps millions of dollars every year just to keep the Pakistan Railways operational. The Chinese train revival plan began in earnest in 2022. That's when 46 high-speed made-in-China coaches were delivered to Pakistan Railways by the China Railway Construction Corporation. The investment has ignited a new lease of life to a crumbling railway system.
Assalamu alaikum. Muhammad Javed Tanoli.
50-year-old Tanoli has been driving the Chinese racks since 2022, when they were commissioned into the Green Line Express.
पहले भी थे चाइना से ही आए हुए थे लेकिन ये तो सबसे लेटेस्ट मॉडल आया और ये अच्छे ट्रेन है तो जब चाइना ML1 का कंप्लीट कर जाएगा तो फेंसिंग हो जाएगी हमें उसमें बहुत ज़्यादा फ़ायदा होगा अर्निंग होगी ना, सबसे बड़ी बात तो ये है कि हम गाड़ी चला रहे हैं कि अर्निंग के लिए, पैसों के लिए। तो पैसे जब पैसेंजर ज़्यादा आएंगे तो इंशाअल्लाह लजीज़ हमारी फ्रेट भी अच्छी हो जाएगी और क्विक सर्विस हो जाएगी। हम अर्ली पहुँचा देंगे, गुड्स किसी को होगा या पैसेंजर होगा तो अर्ली पहुँचेगा तो इंशाअल्लाह के फजल से वो और ही ज़्यादा आएंगे। हमारी में ये है कि हमें हमारी तनख्वाह में भी इंक्रीजमेंट आएगी, बेहतरी होगी कि हम फ्यूचर में कि वो हमें हमारे लिए बेहतर सोचेगी। पैसे होंगे तो हमें कुछ देगी ना, पैसे नहीं होंगे तो कैसे हमारी वेलफेयर इतनी अच्छी करेगी।
According to the Pakistan government, the China-Pakistan economic corridor investments like these have created more than 200,000 jobs in the country till now. But have these investments been able to generate enough revenue to repay the loans?
At the moment, CPEC has not generated any exportable surpluses. You know, trade is not an answer to Pakistan. Trade will only help China because it reduces the distance. So Pakistan needs to come up with a policy to leverage this investment. If we don't do it, I'm afraid the economic returns on CPEC will remain lower than what is being sold.
Pakistan is really the epitome of what's wrong with the multilateral system, and poor Pakistan has to pay for this. The IMF has gone in there and imposed austerity with no debt relief, while at the same time international aid agencies are there, the United Nations and others, and non-governmental organizations trying to help people with the flood and recover. And China, on the other hand, is trying to give new financing for liquidity and also new infrastructure programs. And you have different policies going in different direction. Because of the fragmentation and the misalignment of all the different policies that are happening in Pakistan, things are probably going to get worse rather than getting better.
Small countries like us are going to be financed by somebody, they're going to be in somebody's camp. I don't worry about it. Yes, we get loans from China, but we've got loans from the US agencies, we've got loans from multilateral agencies, also US agencies. So we still have more loans to them than to China. So I don't hold, that's geopolitics, that's not something I worry about. We can get a loan from wherever we like. But if we ourselves are incapable of doing anything, if we are stupid, it's our fault, nobody else's fault.
The debt crisis that Pakistan is facing is not unique. The World Bank has sounded the alarm that there are about 70 countries that need debt treatment. This number is a record high.
About 60% of low-income countries are either in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress.
We're actually in that really serious and critical situation now because debt repayments are at their highest levels in 25 years, and we're expecting them to go even higher in 2024.
The global economy has seen 4 major debt waves since the 1970s. There was a Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s, the Asian financial crisis of the late 90s, and the global financial crisis starting in 2007. All of these were periods where countries accumulate a lot of debt really fast. Each of these debt waves ended when there were big economic shocks, culminating in widespread economic meltdown. Some experts say we are in a 4th debt wave now.
2007年的次贷危机呢，是一个小浪潮的话，只是打灭了在沙滩上的某个人为的砌造的一个沙雕的话，那么这一轮的这个债务的危机呢，它是一次大浪，它有可能会打烂在沿海的很多大厦。换句话说，这一次的债务的浪潮对人类的经济的冲击如果一旦爆发的话，会远远超过当年的2007年的次贷危机引发的全球经济危机。
The cracks are showing.
Analysts believe Islamabad, with more than $121 billion in external debt, is heading in the same direction as Colombo.
The experts say that only a major debt write-off could save the Zambian economy.
And in Egypt, an economy dependent on tourism was hammered by the triple punch of COVID-19, soaring food and energy prices. By December 2022, it required a $3 billion IMF package to stay afloat. In March 2023, it was reported that many more Egyptians now have to turn to food banks for help. And Ghana is in its worst economic crisis in a generation.
Certain social interventions that government had will be affected, like critical example, the free HSS, free school feeding program, because the government was an intervention, free. But now, where are you going to get the money?
Ghana also needed an IMF bailout package. In Lebanon, hundreds of protesters tried to break through the fence leading to the government headquarters. The country is in the grip of the worst economic and financial crisis in its modern history, with a serious debt problem. In Southeast Asia, the World Bank says that Laos is being weighed down by the need to service large external debts, amounting to 89% of GDP in 2022.
Governments are paying more in debt repayments than they are able to invest in essential public services like healthcare and education and to fight the climate emergency. When people can't access decent healthcare, when they can't access decent education, it affects them both today, but also affects their longer-term prospects and collectively affects the prospects of whole economies.
If you're spending 60 cents of every dollar on servicing debts, you have to make trade-offs. And a lot of countries right now, according to the United Nations, there are 48 countries representing 3.3 billion people that are spending more money on debt service than they are on education or health care. That is immense.
How did the world get here? To understand the origins, let's wind back the clock to 2008. After the financial crisis, interest rates were very low to encourage people to borrow and make investments.
But when interest rates are really low in the global north, that pushes credit, because it's cheap, into emerging market and developing countries. Of course, they were able to borrow at very low rates. And most emerging market and developing countries boomed from that.
Private creditors also expanded their lending in developing countries to take advantage of higher interest rates.
The private creditors are essentially banks, hedge funds, investors. So, for example, BlackRock is one of the biggest lenders to lower-income countries, and banks like UBS and HSBC. So all the banks that kind of buy up and trade bonds in lower-income countries, they hold a lot of the debt from lower-income countries.
And then there was China's Belt and Road Initiative. Over $1 trillion borrowed from Chinese banks was spent all over the world on highways, railways, ports, government buildings, dams, and power generation plants. But right before COVID, some experts sounded the alarm that this spate of borrowing from China, from private lenders, and from multilateral lenders was adding up to more than countries can afford to pay. And then COVID hit. Governments needed billions of dollars to fight the disease. Economies slowed. Russia invaded Ukraine, pushing up the prices of oil, fertilizers, and wheat, leading to skyrocketing inflation across the world. Then there were climate shocks, destroying crops and requiring emergency funds from governments to deal with those crises. And the straw that has broken the camel's back is the high interest rates that countries now have to pay for the loans they took when interest rates were low.
COVID, war in Ukraine, climate change, interest rate hikes, globalization of inflation from the advanced economies, that some countries could handle the first couple strikes, But we're past 3 strikes for so many countries, and that's why the IMF is seeing 70 countries as potentially the next Sri Lankas out there, and we really have to act and act urgently.
Builders from China are nearing completion of what will be the tallest building in Africa. The 78-story iconic tower in Egypt's yet-to-be-named new capital.
埃及新首都 CBD 项目的建设，它将会改变埃及没有国际一流标准的中央商务区的历史。同时呢，它也将助推埃及2030年愿景的实现。
This is one part of the new city that has been built by China as part of its Belt and Road Plan. This city will eventually house 6.5 million people and replace Cairo as Egypt's capital city. Chinese firms will also build a rail line connecting this to Cairo. But can Egypt afford a project of such epic proportions? As it turns out, Egypt needed to seek a bailout from the IMF, which in December 2023 approved a $3 billion loan to provide some relief. According to the Middle East Institute, Egypt owes China nearly $8 billion. This Southeast Asia country is now mired in debt, half of it owed to China. Debt has ballooned rapidly due to borrowings from China for its hydropower projects, as well as a massive high-speed rail project. Laos' foreign reserves have been dangerously inadequate for some time, providing barely enough to cover imports for a couple of months. In 2022, the Laotian currency fell about 70% against the US dollar compared to the previous year. China is the world's largest bilateral creditor. A number of these countries currently in debt distress have taken on massive infrastructure projects under the Belt and Road Initiative. Do the cases of Pakistan, Laos, Egypt, and Sri Lanka point to what critics have called the debt trap diplomacy?
Well, the Chinese debt trap argument has really been discredited over and over and over again. And if it was happening, this would be the time where we'd see it. Because now many of the countries that China has lent financing to are in massive debt distress. So if the narrative of a debt trap is, let me lend you money so I can take a port or so I can take certain assets from you, here's where we should be seeing China all around the world grabbing ports and ships and capitals and all of this. And on the contrary, China's been perhaps the most active in certain kinds of debt relief, and they're also giving countries more money to try to get out of these crises in the short term so that they can get paid back in the intermediate term.
有一些大型项目，比如说埃及的新首都或者是老挝的高铁，他们都是由“一带一路”倡议资助的。一些经济学家就会质疑说，这些国家是否真的需要这些项目呢？
实际上，所谓“一带一路”基建项目的高风险呢，是基于西方经济学的逻辑推演基础上的。在中国来讲，“一带一路”推进的大项目的合作啊，是低风险的，是可持续的。为什么这么讲呢？第一呢，就是这些基建的项目都是有助于改善当地民生的。你可以看到，无论是在中国，在非洲投资的3000多个基建项目，还是当下在东南亚推进的中老铁路啊，这个印尼的雅万高铁啊等等，都是当地需要的。哪个项目是当地不需要的呢？没有，都是应当地民生改善之需求。第二呢，这些项目呢都是可持续的。通过投资这样的项目，可以可持续地推动当地的经济的增长，可以可持续地改善当地的民生，使得当地社会的交易成本急剧的下降。过去的中国40年的发展不就是这个原理吗？大量的投资基础建设，那么城市的地价、房价交易成本越来越改善，使得这些债务化解。换句话说，发展才是化解债务的钥匙。
According to the World Bank, 46% of debt repayments are to private lenders, excluding China. About 30% are to multilateral institutions, 12% to other governments, and 12% to Chinese public and private lenders.
China, as a lender, needs to also be more careful in its loans and take more responsibility around its lending. We've seen that Chinese government loans, for example, to countries like Zambia and Djibouti have contributed to the debt crises in those countries. But also, we also find a lot of Western media and Western governments are very keen to use China as a scapegoat, as a way to detract or to deflect its own culpability and also the role of private lenders, which do, like I said, make up a really big class of creditors when it comes to global South repayments and who they're due to.
As debt burden contributes to political instability and the crisis builds, a solution is urgently needed. But geopolitics gets in the way.
Assistance from the IFIs come with strong requirements for governance, accountability, and debt sustainability. It serves as an important counterweight to non-transparent, unsustainable lending from others like China.
去年以来，美国以前所未有的幅度加息，使有关国家债务问题雪上加霜。 导致全球金融市场震荡加剧。
The International Monetary Fund has been the world's lender of last resort since World War II, but it now faces competition. Research shows that China is providing ever more emergency loans to debt-ridden countries. In 2021 alone, China gave $40.5 billion in loans to distressed countries, many of whom have existing projects under the Belt and Road Initiative. In comparison, the IMF lent $68.6 billion to countries in financial distress in 2021. The number is even more significant over a longer time horizon. Between 2008 and 2021, China spent $240 billion bailing out 22 developing countries.
中国以我们本身在国内行之有效的经济发展经验，向全世界贡献中国的发展智慧，让那些发展中国家呢提升经济发展的能力。我觉得这才是中国最关切的，而不是说我们中国关切，中国是不是最后贷款人或者最大的债权人，这不是中国最关切的目的。
China offering these bailout loans is basically copying what Western lenders do. So the Chinese government has been bailing out its own creditors. And that's something that the IMF has long been doing. So the IMF in the 1980s, 1990s, in response to the debt crisis emerging in lower income countries back then, lent more money to these countries in order to enable them to keep paying their creditors. So actually, when we talk about this language around bailout, actually the bailout is not for the country in crisis. The bailout is for its creditors, and in particular, its private creditors, the banks and hedge funds. So the banks and hedge funds who have lent recklessly at very high interest rates then get paid off, and then they're sitting very happy, and it also means that they're then incentivized to then lend recklessly again in future, knowing that there's always a lender of last resort in the backdrop. And so that's what we've seen China imitating the role of the IMF, that instead of offering countries debt restructuring when they get into a debt crisis, they're offering them more loans, and so creating even more indebtedness.
In 2022, China pledged to forgive 23 loans for 17 African countries, but it did not specify the amount of loan forgiveness. Whether it is in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, or Zambia, with China and the IMF both involved in bailouts, negotiations have gotten slower and more complicated.
So as a major creditor, China plays a critical role in the global financial ecosystem. So therefore, for any sovereign debt restructuring framework to be effective, it needs the support of China. China has come forward and joined a number of multilateral initiatives. They came forward and they joined the debt service suspension initiative that was launched by the G20 in May of 2020. So while we may see that it would be helpful if there was more predictability and clarity about the time it might take a country undergoing a treatment under the common framework to reach certain milestones, I think we have to also recognize that this is really the first time that China's had to work in a multilateral environment to help resolve these problems. So there has been a lot of work on building understanding of our policy frameworks, of how other creditors work, of how the debtor countries work. And that has taken time. But I really hope that the leadership and the effort that China is really putting into these cases will help other cases move faster if needed.
Almost half of all lower income debt repayments are owed to private creditors. Private creditors have often lent to lower income countries at very high interest rates. They lent to them at 6 to 10% at a time when they were lending to countries like the UK and US at 0 to 1%. And they would argue that they lent at such high interest rates in order to cover their risk, the risk of not being paid. And actually, now that that risk has materialized, they need to take the hit. Very much like, in gambling terms, if you make a bet and actually you lose that bet, you do make a bit of a loss and you take responsibility for making that loss. But now they're trying to have their cake and eat it. They're now trying to force countries to pay back the full amount. And so we think that the Western governments actually have a responsibility to try and bring China to the table around debt restructuring by forcing their private creditors to come to the table in order to all engage in a way that is fair for all creditors.
If we wanted to be more constructive multilateralists, someone like Janet Yellen could really strike a deal with the Chinese and say, look, if we rein in New York and bring those private sector actors to the table and they responsibly reduce their debt in a particular country, Pakistan or Sri Lanka, China, can you do the same thing? What is complex today is that there are multitudes of different creditors with different interests, all within a specific country. And a relatively poor country like Pakistan or Sri Lanka has to sit there with BlackRock, the Chinese Finance Ministry, the Paris Club, all there, and try to get them all to agree to a particular deal. Each one of those has a lot more power and a lot more going into that deal. And it really takes leadership across the creditors to make sure that the country can be in better shape. If we don't get to that, there's a convenient game of finger pointing that goes on when a country suffers. The private sector can say, I'm not going to give Pakistan a break because Pakistan will take the money and pay the Chinese, and the Chinese can say, I'm not going to give Pakistan a break because Pakistan will take the money and play BlackRock.
It's not just developing countries dealing with debt problems. China also faces a debt issue. Having spent over $1 trillion on the Belt and Road Initiative, how much is there left in the coffers to deal with a slowing economy and a growing military budget?
当下的这个全球的债务啊，已经到了100年来最高的这样的程度啊，已经到了堰塞湖破裂的前夜啊。这有几个原因构成。第一个呢，就是欧美国家的债务到达了一个顶峰啊，美国呢再次突破所谓美债的上限。第二呢，就是不少发展中国家的债务呢也进入到一个崩溃的边缘。那么第三呢，也包括中国在内啊，中国的地方债呢也非常的严重，所以应该说全球的债务危机啊，到了历史上都没有出现过的这样的一个非常艰难的时刻。化解债务危机成了现在防止全球经济危机爆发的一个必不可少的手段。如果这些债务无法得到化解，那么全球将会爆发一场超过2008年甚至像1930年代那样的大萧条式的经济危机的爆发。
As the global debt burden mounts, What is the way forward? This dance performance symbolizes the message from developing countries. One dancer represents the West, the other represents China. The message? It takes two to tango. A creative protest that comes with a serious message. Debt reform is needed urgently across the world. The world needs the two superpowers to lock hands and work together.